Hey everyone, my name is Michael. I'm the developer advocate lead here at Xano, and today we're going to continue our Connect to FlutterFlow series with the topic of Google OAuth. So we're going to leverage Xano's Google OAuth extension in order to authenticate a user and then get a Xano AuthToken back so we can start hitting authenticated endpoints between Xano and FlutterFlow. Now, Google OAuth concepts, or just OAuth concepts in general, are going to be taught in this tutorial. So whether you're signing in with Apple, with Twitter, with Facebook, the same idea and flow is going to be used. Now, today we're going to show how to do this with a FlutterFlow web app. Now, if you're going to do this with the mobile version, whether it's Android or iOS, there's a few extra steps, and I'll show you where you can find that information in the FlutterFlow documentation. It involves setting up your URL and domain. It's a lot easier to show using the web app version, but once again, same concepts and ideas apply. There's just a little extra setup when going the mobile route. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Google OAuth between Xano and FlutterFlow. So the very first thing we're going to do is start in Xano, go to the marketplace, and then into the user authentication extensions. You'll find Google OAuth, and then make sure to get this and then actually install it into your workspace. You'll notice there's a couple things you need to get to actually configure the extension, that being your client ID and client secret from Google. Now, I'm not going to go through all that because there's separate tutorials and these detailed instructions on how to get that from your Google Developer Console. So we're going to assume that you can follow these directions and already get that information. But let's jump over to the API to talk about the flow of Google OAuth, because it's always really good to review. So into my API over here in the Google OAuth group that comes from the marketplace extension, you can see there's 4 endpoints. Today we're going to work with Initialize, which is going to kick off the Google OAuth flow, and then continue. And why we're going to use continue instead of sign up and login, because continue is inclusive of both. Sign up only handles new users, login only handles existing users. So continue, no matter if you're brand new to the app or already have an account, and continue is going to be inclusive of both. So Initialize endpoint. This is actually going to take in our redirect URI from our front end and give us back a URL that's going to take us to the Google hosted web page where the OAuth consent screen is. That's when we can sign into our Google account and actually authorize our FlutterFlow app to use our Google information. That's going to then send us back to that redirect URI, so back to our front end. And then on page load, there'll be a code in the URL that Google sends us back to. We're going to parse that in FlutterFlow, and then we're going to do some checks with Google to make sure that that's all good. There'll be an access token from Google, and if that works, we're going to exchange that for a Xano authentication token, and that way we can start to hit any endpoints that require authentication in Xano. So then we can complete that whole authentication process. And what about this redirect URI? How do we get this from our FlutterFlow front end? Now, as mentioned at the top of the video, we'll be showing you how to get that from a web app version that enables deep linking in FlutterFlow. Now, of course, if you are doing iOS or Android, there's some additional setup that you'll need to do in FlutterFlow. And they have really great documentation on setting that all up. If you go to deep and dynamic linking, we'll make sure to link this up in the video details so you can jump to this. But it's all about setting up your URL scheme in your domain, whether you are doing Android or iOS. They have information to all of this, so you can actually see here, go ahead and get your URL scheme, so then you can use that for your redirect URI. Now we'll also need to make sure we put our redirect URI in our Google console, and you can also see that in the instructions on the Xano marketplace. But let's first show you how to get that for the sake of this video in FlutterFlow. So if we navigate over on the left side to settings and integration, and then platforms, you can see Android and iOS are selected, but we want to select web, which enables deep linking. You can see right there. And when we do this, you can come back to your app details and see that our URL scheme will be given. But also on the top right, when we have the option to either run in run mode or test mode, you can see there's now publish your app to the web. And if I publish this, Well, first it'll give me what this URL is going to be, but I'll actually need to go ahead and publish that to set that actually live. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit publish, and this will just take a second. So once that's absolutely published, you'll see there's a timestamp for when it's deployed. Now if we actually go to this, we should see what our FlutterFlow app actually looks like. Now obviously mine's blank right now, so we're not seeing a lot, but this is a great sign. So now we are ready to rock. Let's go back to our UI builder because, okay, great. We have a URL for our app, but now we need to get our specific redirect URI. Now our homepage is where users are going to land to actually say, okay, sign me in with Google. But the redirect URI is going to have to be a page with some guardrails up, right? We actually need to authenticate into that page in order to access it. So we're going to need a new page. And I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new page. And let's call this auth page. And I'll create this from blank, create page. And now on this auth page, what we'll see on the right side here, we have route settings. So this will be our subpath of our actual URL that we've just been given. And of course here we can go ahead and customize this name to our heart's desired. I'm just going to leave it here as auth page. But now I have my redirect URI. So if I come back to publish here, and if I grab this, it's not letting me copy. So let me just come back to that blank app here and come back. And now we have our redirect URI. So what's very important now is I need to go back into my Google console. So I will pop in there and set my redirect URI. So over here in my Google console, in my credentials for my client ID for web application, I can go ahead and add my authorized redirect URI. And here is the URL for my app, but now I need the path or the route of that auth page. And great, so I can go ahead and I'm gonna copy this whole thing, but let's go ahead and save this for now. Awesome, so that's saved. Let's go do a quick test in Xano. So let's go to our init endpoint and let's run this with that entire redirect URI. So there we go. Remember with that route auth page, let's go ahead and run this. And we should get a URL back that's going to take me to my Google OAuth consent screen. So let me navigate to that page and we can actually choose one of our Google accounts here. And we should be redirected back to our auth page, which is great. And what you're not seeing right now is Google put in a code parameter to the URL, which has the code that I'm going to need to take and pass through the continue endpoint. And actually, if I just drag down so you can my screen here, so you can see my URL, you can see here is the whole URL, and then here's that code parameter, right? And you can see right here it says 4%2f. That actually indicates that our browser URL has done some encoding on this value. So we're going to actually need to make sure to decode that in order to pass the correct value. And that %2f is just standard URL encoding, so we should actually be seeing a / here. But let's go ahead and I'll show you how to make sure Xano can correct for that. So back over to Xano, let's navigate to our continue endpoint here. So we're going to take in that code in that redirect URI. Now remember that code is going to be URL encoded. So what I want to do on this first function here, where we take that input from the code, I'm going to add a URL decode filter right there. I'm going to make sure to update that, save that, and let's publish this. And so now I need those two inputs. So first my code, let's go ahead and paste that in, and then my redirect URI. So let me go ahead and grab that one more time, and I'll paste it in here, and that is /auth page is the route. So let's go ahead and run this. And we get a successful response. So we get our Xano AuthToken. You can see this is the information that Google's sending back about the user's name and email. So we are ready to rock. Let's set up these API calls in FlutterFlow next. So back to my FlutterFlow application. If we go to API calls, I'm going to create a new API call, and we'll call this first one Google Initialize. And let's come back into here and let's copy that endpoint URL And let's paste this in. Now we need a query parameter this time. So let's add a new query parameter, and this is going to be our redirect URI. This is because we're passing back these endpoints from Xano and Google. So Google is going to be looking in the URL for certain values. So we need to make sure to set these as query parameters. So this is actually going to be a specific value. This is going to be a string. Remember, this doesn't need to be dynamic. And let me just go ahead and grab this again from run and debug, this whole value here of my redirect URI. And we can go ahead and simply paste that in. And so I can go ahead and test this API call now. So if I hit test call, we see there's that auth URL with the successful response. I go into recommended. I make sure to select that auth URL. And we'll just name that auth URL and go ahead and add that call, make sure that's saved. And let's add the continue endpoint now too. So API call, let's come over back to Xano now, and I'm gonna grab that endpoint URL, and I'll come down here to where the API URL is required and enter it here. Let's call this Google continue. And once again, I will need query parameters. So the first one will be code, and the other one will be redirect URI. And the code will actually be from a variable because we need this to be dynamic. We'll hit create new variable there, and the redirect URI is going to be a specific value. It'll be a string, and let's see if we can grab that one more time from our init endpoint. So just quickly copy that and come back here, paste that in. And then we need to jump to variables because we're creating that code one and set this as a string. No default value. One thing to really take into consideration with code is pretty standard in OAuth. They're always one-time use. So whether you're doing sign in with Google, Apple, Twitter, etc., I'll see oftentimes users will be trying to test and debug, and they're using the same code over and over, and they're like, everything is broken. Well, you need to actually go through the flow and generate a new code every single time that you want to hit the continue or sign in or log in endpoint. So just keep that in mind. So when we go to response and test, we actually need to go and generate a brand new code. So back to this init endpoint, let me go ahead and run this. I'm just going to make sure I copy this entire URL, and let's go there. I'll quickly sign in, and then I'll grab the code from the URL. Now with that code, I'll just paste it in here. Let's give a look at the API URL, and I must not have grabbed the whole code. There should be a 4 here at the beginning. Good thing I checked. So we have, remember, 4, and then %2f is indicating it's actually doing that URL encode. So once again, in Xano, we have applied that URL decode filter to get us the proper value. But this looks great. Let's go ahead and test this API call. And we get our successful response. So there's our token, our name, and email. So let's go to recommended. Let's go ahead and select all these things for now. The most important thing is really just the auth token, which I'll name here. We'll say name, and we'll also say email. And then let's add this call. And one more endpoint I'm going to go ahead and do in Xano will be that auth me endpoint. And the reason I'll do that is just to demonstrate us actually hitting an authenticated endpoint in Xano. Remember, this is going to take in just the auth token and get the user's information. So let me just copy this endpoint URL and come back to FlutterFlow. I'll hit create API call. So it looks like my developer account on FlutterFlow is limited to 2 API calls per project, which is not very many. FlutterFlow, if you're out there, let's bump that up, please. No problem. You can watch our authentication video to see how you can then use the auth token, but I'll show you how to store that in an app state, and it's pretty easy to pass that through as a header once you have that to hit authenticated endpoints. So let's jump over to the UI now, and let's add a button to our home page. We'll call this continue with Google, and Google needs to be spelled correctly there. And let's open our action flow editor, and our first action will be an API call to the Google initiation, and we should have hard-coded in that redirect URI, so we should not need to define any parameters here. We have this API result, so we'll say if successful, what we want to do is add another action. So under share, we have launch URL, and the URL that we want to use is from our variable. It's going to be from our action output, this API result, and JSON body, JSON path, and it'll be that auth URL. So that'll take us to that that web page for that's hosted by Google, right? Great. So let's go ahead and close this. And next, let's go to our auth page. So here, what we can do is we can add maybe a few text fields. We'll have the whole response here from that API call. So we'll go ahead and have that name, email, and I'll display the auth token here, but I also want to show how you can add that to an app state. So let me go ahead and set that app state up real quick. This is going to be our auth token, which we're going to store in. And some users have recommended to me that you select persisted here. If when someone leaves the app and comes back in, they're still logged in. So you can go ahead and select maybe persisted there if that's the kind of flow you want. I'm going to do that for this use case. But what we want here for the entire auth page, we want to open up our actions. And what action we want to do is, and actually let me make sure, we do add action because it needs to be on page load. So on page load is when we're going to take that code from the URL that Google sends us, use it to the API call, and then we'll get our information back, right? So on page load, now let's open our action. And this is going to be another API call. So we'll go to Backend database, and this will be our continue call. And we need to set an additional variable, and that's going to be our code. In our value, we're going to get from page parameters, and the parameter name is going to be code. And let's go ahead and confirm that. Great. So that will be able to parse that URL parameter called code and get that token for us, so we can actually authenticate. So if true, let's go ahead and do a couple things. So let's go to state management and add a field here. That'll be that auth token, and we'll set a value, and we'll set that to our action output, this API response, JSON body, JSON path, and this will be that actual auth token, right? One other thing we want to do here, so let's actually go ahead and see if we can populate some of those text fields. So, and actually, as I look through this, I realize we will do that in the UI. So let me delete this. In false here, if we're false, remember we don't, or if the API call is not successful, well, remember we don't want to end up on this page. So let's actually add a action here to navigate to our home page. So we land back on our home page in case it is not successful. So if I go into my text here, I should be able to get action outputs. So we'll go ahead and set this as our name. We'll confirm that. We'll go ahead and do email, and I'll skip ahead here. You get the flow. Great, so I've set the name, email, and auth token that comes back in the response from that action output API call. But now what we're ready to do is we're ready to publish these changes. So we'll go to publish, and then we'll actually hit publish, and then we're ready to demo this out. So once that's published, let's go ahead and check it out. And so if we open this, you can see here's our continue with Google. We open this up. Now we're taken to our Google hosted web page with that auth URL. We're going to go ahead and choose an account. And then we navigate back to our FlutterFlow app. And here we are. So here's the information that's coming from that API response. Here's my auth token. Definitely don't display the auth token on the page like this. Remember, you're going to store it in that app state like I showed in the action editor, but I just wanted to show, hey, here's everything from that response. So you'll use that app state to pass through as a header for those authenticated endpoints that you hit in Xano. So unfortunately, we were blocked by a limitation, a plan limitation in FlutterFlow, but the idea is pretty simple to use. And we also have a video with FlutterFlow and Xano authentication passing a token in that manner. But there you have it. That's how you would do OAuth with FlutterFlow and Xano. So once again, no need for Firebase. This is all native to Xano. We use the FlutterFlow web platform to actually showcase this, so we could use deep linking. Of course, remember there is the documentation for setting up Android and iOS if you're doing mobile. So check that out, but the concepts really are basically the exact same. You'll hit that initialize endpoint, go to a external web page hosted by Google. They're going to send you back to a page in your FlutterFlow app that you specify with a code URL parameter that you need to grab, and then hit continue with Google. So there you have it. Hope this video was helpful and informational. Remember, these concepts apply to more than just Google sign-in. It's really any OAuth service. The same idea, same flow is going to persist. So thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next video.